This is part of the series Common Counters to the Origin of Life and How They Fail. I will have videos on James Tour's claims specifically and those that aren't specific to James Tour, but this is James Tour Part 1. Tour is an expert. Now you'll see I'm using the term anti-evolutionist. Not accurate, but I don't know a better term. Another word for the origin of life is abiogenesis, but most people don't know what abiogenesis is. I've never heard the term anti-abiogenesis, so that doesn't make sense. If I say anti-science, that's accurate, but it could be too broad because, we're talking about a specific subfield in science. And most people who are against the natural origin of life are against natural evolution and vice versa. So it's the best I could think of. So, their claim is that James Tour is an expert on the origin of life, and he says it can't happen. James Tour is a world-renowned synthetic organic chemist, one of the leading chemists in the world today, and he says life cannot originate naturally. He points out that molecules have no desire to move towards life, and in fact, they move away from life. Tour has also pointed out that a leading origin of life scientist called origin of life research a scam. Counters to their claim. Well, basically, there's only one counter. James Tour is not an expert on the origin of life. There's multiple reasons for this, but there's only one counter to it. He's not. So one, James Tour does not make and has never made his living by working on trying to solve the origin of life in a science lab that works on trying to solve the origin of life. Experts, Jack Shostak, Lee Cronin, John Sutherland, Leslie Orgel, Gerald Joyce, lots of others, they make their living trying to solve the origin of life, working in labs that work on trying to solve the origin of life. James Tour does not. Second, experts on the origin of life, such as Gerald Joyce, Leslie Orgel, Jack Shostak, etc., have many peer-reviewed papers on the origin of life published in mainstream science journals. On the other hand, James Tour has not published any peer-reviewed scientific papers on the origin of life in any mainstream peer-reviewed scientific journal. What does Tour do? He gives lectures at churches to religious lay people. When I say lay people here, I'm talking about non-scientists. Your general person in the pews at a church. Tour gives lectures at churches to religious lay people and publishes or propagates hokum in or for illegitimate sources, such as the anti-science creationist organization, the Discovery Institute. Quick aside, the Discovery Institute is a religious anti-science organization. They pretend to be speaking science, but it's just like any other creationists. They're distorting science because of their religious motivations. They are anti-naturalism and want supernaturalism. They want supernaturalism to replace naturalism, not just in society, but in schools too. If you remember back to the 2005-2006 Dover, PA case of intelligent design, where it got walloped, where it was found not to be science, ID was not science, and ID was religious. And they even had the evidence. This wasn't just part of the ruling. They had the evidence showing that intelligent design is just creationism relabeled. The Discovery Institute is the major ID, quote-unquote, think tank. They're an anti-science, religious organization that distorts science. Okay, 3, James Tour is unaware of some major advances in the field of origin of life research. I will give one example soon in a follow-up video. And 4, James Tour is so clueless about the origin of life that he has repeatedly shown images of and has discussed eukaryotic cells and even yeast interactomes when talking about the origin of life, as though they were directly relevant. Quickly, there's in modern cells, there's two main types, prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells are the complex ones, the ones that have a nucleus, that have membrane-bound organelles, such as mitochondria and Golgi bodies or Golgi apparatus, lysosomes, things like that. So, the origin of life is thought to have occurred about 4 billion years ago, give or take. And off the top of my head, I believe eukaryotes are thought to have appeared about 1.8 billion years ago. I'm fine if you check up on me. I want the truth out there. It's not, hey, this guy said it, therefore it's true. Go search for yourself. But it was about 1.8 billion years ago, I believe. Based on those numbers, that means the first eukaryotic cell did not appear until after 2.2 billion years of basically bacterial evolution. You know how fast bacteria evolve? They had 2.2 billion years of evolution before you had the first eukaryotic cell. Eukaryotic cells are irrelevant to the origin of life. No origin of life scientist says that the first cell had a nucleus, or had mitochondria, or had lysosomes, or Golgi bodies, or rough endoplasmic reticulum, or a complex proteinaceous cytoskeleton, such as with tubulin and actin and myosin filaments and all this stuff. None of that was in the first cell. Eukaryotic cells are irrelevant to the origin of life. Then yeast interactomes is even worse. Okay, again, this is off the top of my head. Go and investigate and check for yourself. But I believe yeast are thought to have appeared within the last 1 billion years of Earth history. What that would mean is that evolution had some 3 billion years to produce yeast. What do yeast are eukaryotic cells, so they're irrelevant right there. But then they weren't the first eukaryotes. There was another, I don't know, some 800 million years or so of evolution before you get to yeast. What do yeast have to do with the origin of life? Absolutely nothing. And by the way, Tor has also shown pictures of prokaryotic cells, but even they are irrelevant to the origin of life. What he does is he lists a modern, evolved prokaryotic cell and lists parts and points, has labels pointing to them, such as a flagellum. Show me any origin of life researcher who says the first cell was a prokaryotic cell with a flagellum. He shows other things. No, that also is irrelevant to the origin of life, but not as bad as eukaryotic cells, which are not as bad as yeast interactomes. Anyway, Tor's clueless. And some final points. James Tor is an expert on the origin of life, and he says it can't happen naturally. Well, actually, a recent Harvard debate, after the debate on stage, this was all planned. This wasn't like some ad hoc thing. They went and had dinner, and they're sitting at a round table, a literal round table, large round table, with about 10 people. I don't remember how many. So there's the two debaters, James Tor and Lee Cronin, and then some 6 or 8, I guess, other people who were philosophers, scientists, stuff like that. And the discussion carried there. That was a long discussion there too, and it was recorded. And in it, someone asked Tor if he thinks a natural explanation for the origin of life would be found. And he said yes. Tor said yes. Tor also explicitly said that he believes God created life. So, he's not saying that he believes it happened naturally, but he thinks there is a natural explanation for the origin of life. Now, is Tor talking out of both sides of his mouth? I personally think he is. I can't prove that he is, but I think when he talks to religious people, he makes it sound like there is no possible natural origin of life. But then when he's talking to scientists, philosophers, more of his peers, he then tries to save face, maybe? I don't know. Or tries to throw them a bone so he's not a purely anti-science religious person, and says, oh yeah, I think that a natural origin of life will eventually be found. I don't know. That's my belief that he's talking out of both sides of his mouth. Okay, James Tor is a world-famous synthetic organic chemist, one of the leading chemists in the world today. You'll hear this all the time. It's funny that when creationists are quoting a scientist or referring to a scientist, it's always the leading scientist in the world. The world-famous chemist is everyone walking down the street knows this guy. But anyway, what they're using here, at least at this part of the argument, is what's called a logical fallacy of appeal to authority. This authority says it, therefore it's true. Some quick things. First of all, you have to be the right type of authority. I have a typo there. That should be commander-in-chief. The point here is there's 2 types of authorities, at least 2. Authority by position and authority by expertise. The President of the United States is the ultimate authority of the United States Armed Forces. That is based on position. An example, now, our president, Jimmy Carter, years ago, Jimmy Carter was a peanut farmer from a small town in Georgia. I think it was called Plains, Georgia. As far as I know, Jimmy Carter was in no way an expert on military strategy. Yet when he was president, just by being elected to that position, he became the ultimate authority on the U.S. military. That's authority by position. That's useless. What you need is authority by expertise. And that for the U.S. president is provided by the military advisors. They are hopefully experts on military strategy and military in general. They are the experts who advise the president. Okay, so you want experts, not position. The second problem is the authority expert needs to be an expert in the relevant field. My example here is Fred Hoyle. Fred Hoyle was an astronomer who was famous. He was knighted, but he had problems even in his own field. Long after the evidence fully supported the Big Bang, Hoyle continued to push his steady state model of the universe. He obstinately clung on to it long after he should have given up on it. He eventually came around and said the Big Bang is the better model, but he obstinately clung to it long after he should have. So there's a problem in his own field. But the point here is Hoyle made a fool of himself a couple times when he tried to stick his nose into biology. One of them was he claimed that the fossils of Archaeopteryx were frauds. They weren't. They were legitimate fossils. He made a fool of himself. And then second, he's the one that came up, it's even called Hoyle's fallacy sometimes. He's the one that came up with this silly analogy of a tornado running through a junkyard and assembling a fully functional 747, Boeing 747. It's a jet, large passenger jet. Now, even if you use that analogy for the origin of life, it's still a logical fallacy. It's a false analogy. But I believe, I'm not positive, check me on this, that he used it as an analogy for evolution. That would be completely ridiculous. That is a horrible, horrible, horrible straw man logical fallacy. For the analogy is so horrible for evolution. Anyway, so the person needs to be an expert in the relevant field too. If you're talking about biology, you go to biologists. You don't go to geologists. If you're talking about chemistry, you go to a chemist, not a geologist or a biologist. If you're talking about physics, you go to a physicist, not to an astronomer or a biologist. That's why they're separate fields. That's why science is divided up into separate fields, and people go and spend 8 years of their life becoming an expert in one field. And by the way, even within fields, there's subfields. Like you don't go and get a PhD in biology. As far as I know, there's no PhD in biology. There's subfields, like you could get a PhD in maybe genetics, or in cell biology, or in ecology, or something like that, or evolutionary biology. So even these individual fields are subdivided. So you need to be an authority that is an expert, and you have to be an expert in the relevant field, and that expert has to be communicating the consensus of the other experts in the field. Scientists are humans. They are fallible, just like every other human. If you have 99 scientists, 99 out of 100 scientists that say X is true, but then you have 1% of scientists that say X is not true, who do you go with? Well, this guy who's an expert in the relevant field says X is not true, but he's representing a small minority of the scientists in that field. That's an appeal to illegitimate authority. He's not representing the consensus of the majority of experts in the field. Another one I was going to say is that even if you get everything right, they're a legitimate authority, expert, and they're an expert in the relevant field, and they're representing the consensus of experts in that field. That still doesn't mean what they say is true. And my example there is Einstein. When Einstein came up with his general theory of relativity, he was coming up with a formula. He put in a fudge factor called the cosmological constant. Why? Well, because he understood that his equation indicated that the universe should be either contracting or expanding. Well, he believed the universe was static, as did most physicists in the day. So he puts this fudge factor in there to balance things out so that the universe was neither contracting or expanding. So you go back to Einstein, probably, again, the leading scientist, the world-famous leading scientist in physics of the day, and you ask him if the universe is expanding, he says no. So again, there's so many problems with an appeal to authority. I think I covered that to death, even though I didn't do it very well. You get the idea. Okay, so let's keep going. So James Tour, and he says life cannot originate naturally. Actually, he's said that it can, at least when he's talking to educated people like philosophers and scientists at Harvard. And the Tour has also pointed out that a leading origin of life scientist called origin of life research a scam. That is the literal term that origin of life researcher did use. He called it a scam, and that is literally true. What Tour doesn't tell you, by the way, this scientist was Lee Cronin. What Tour doesn't tell you was that the scientist in the same interview said that he was not being serious. This was Lee Cronin was being interviewed by, I think his name is Lex Friedman. I could have that wrong. Anyway, he was being interviewed, and Lee Cronin said that origin of life research is a scam. After having said that, at some point, he notes explicitly that he was being tongue-in-cheek. I don't know the phrase he used. I don't know if he used the term tongue-in-cheek, sarcastic, not serious, whatever. Lee Cronin points out that he was not being serious when he called origin of life research a scam. Tour ignores that point and goes around telling everybody that this origin of life researcher called origin of life research a scam. Tour is being dishonest. Which, again, is one reason why I believe Tour is talking out of both sides of his mouth. When he talks to religious people, he makes it sound like origin of life, a natural origin of life, is literally impossible. Then when he's talking to people at Harvard and other well-educated people, philosophers and all, he says, sure, I think a natural origin of life will be found. Anyway, the main points, I can't go backwards. The main points is James Tour is not an expert on the origin of life. He does not make his living by working on solving the origin of life. He doesn't have any peer-reviewed scientific papers in mainstream scientific journals on the origin of life. He's out of date on some major findings in origin of life research. And he is so clueless about the origin of life that he has repeatedly shown images of and discussed eukaryotic cells and even yeast interactomes as though they were directly relevant to the origin of life. That's the end of this video. Thank you for watching.